The fire crackled in the hearth, its amber glow dancing across the polished oak walls of Henry Caldwell's Hamptons mansion. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the massive windows that framed a view of the churning ink-black sea. It was Christmas Eve, April 08, 2025, and the room glittered with the trappings of wealth. A towering spruce adorned with crystal ornaments, a chandelier dripping with light, a Persian rug that cost more than most people's homes. Yet the air felt hollow, heavy with silence, broken only by the steady tick of an antique clock on the mantel. Henry sat in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey cradled in his hand, the ice clinking faintly as he stared into the flames. Rue, 70, he was a man carved from discipline, tall and lean, silver hair swept back, still dressed in a charcoal suit despite the hour. To the world, he was the unyielding chairman of Caldwell Investments, a titan who'd turned ambition into a billion-dollar empire. But tonight, in this sprawling house, he was just a man alone. His fingers brushed the edge of a drawer in the side table, hesitating before sliding it open. Inside lay a faded photograph, its corners worn from years of secret glances. It showed a younger Henry, 30 years old, broad-shouldered, smiling, standing beside Eleanor, his wife, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. Between them was Sarah, their daughter, barely 5, her tiny hand clutching his, her laugh a sound he could still hear if he closed his eyes. He lifted the photo, his hand trembling slightly, the whiskey forgotten. That laugh, it echoed in his mind, sharp and fleeting, a ghost from a life he'd walked away from 40 years ago. He'd told himself then that success would fill the void, that power was honor, that money could silence regret. But now, with the firelight flickering across the empty room, he wasn't so sure. The buzz of his phone jolted him back. He set the photo down, face up this time, and fished the device from his pocket. A text from his assistant, Claire. NY Post running a piece tomorrow. Claims you abandoned your family for the firm. Want me to kill it? Henry's lips curled into a thin, bitter smile. The press loved their narratives. Ruthless tycoon, heartless mogul. He typed back, let it run. They've got nothing new. He tossed the phone onto the table, the clatter swallowed by the vastness of the room. Let them talk. He'd built his life on steel and numbers, not sentiment. What did they know of the choices he'd made, the nights he'd spent in a Manhattan penthouse signing deals while Eleanor's pleas faded into memory? The doorbell rang, a low, resonant chime that cut through the stillness like a blade. Henry froze, his brow furrowing. No one came here unannounced, not on Christmas Eve, not to this fortress of solitude. He stood, smoothing his jacket, and crossed the room with the measured stride of a man accustomed to control. The cold brass of the doorknob bit into his palm as he turned it, revealing a figure on the threshold. A woman, mid-40s, stood there, her thin coat dusted with snow, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Her hair was pulled back, streaked with gray, and her eyes, those piercing hazel eyes, were Eleanor's, though hardened by time. Sarah, his daughter. She held an old envelope in her gloved hands, its edges yellowed, and her voice, when it came, was steady, but laced with something raw. I'm not here to wish you a Merry Christmas, Dad, she said. Henry's throat tightened, a rare crack in his armor. He hadn't seen her in decades, not since she was a child, not since he'd left her and Eleanor behind for boardrooms and bottom lines. He stepped back, gesturing her in, his voice clipped. What do you want? Money? Sarah's lips twitched, a shadow of a smile that held no warmth. She brushed past him, her boots leaving faint wet prints on the marble floor, and stopped by the fire. The light caught the lines on her face, lines of exhaustion, of a life he hadn't witnessed. She turned, fixing him with a stare that pinned him where he stood, more forceful than any boardroom rival ever had. You think everything's for sale, don't you? She said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. That's why I'm here. Because of Jacob. The name hit him like a punch. Jacob. He didn't know it, didn't recognize it, and yet it stirred something deep, a flicker of dread he couldn't place. His hand tightened around the whiskey glass, the ice rattling louder now. Who's Jacob? He asked, though part of him feared the answer. Sarah didn't flinch. She held up the envelope, her fingers steady despite the tremble in her voice. Your grandson. My son. And I'm not here for your money, Dad. I'm here because you need to know what you left behind, what you can't buy back. Henry's chest constricted, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. A grandson. The word spun in his mind, colliding with the image of that little girl in the photo, now a woman standing before him, accusing him with every word. He wanted to argue, to retreat behind the walls he'd built, money, power, control. But her gaze held him fast, a quiet fury that stripped away his defenses. The fire snapped behind her, casting her shadow long and dark across the room, and, for the first time in years, Henry felt small. Not the titan of Wall Street, not the man who'd conquered markets, but a father who'd run from the one thing that mattered. He set the glass down, the clink loud in the silence, and met her eyes. Why now? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Sarah stepped closer, the envelope still in her hand, her words a blade aimed at his heart. Because I'm running out of time, and you're running out of chances. The clock ticked on, marking the seconds of a night that had just begun to unravel. Outside, the wind howled louder, but inside, the storm was only starting. The firelight flickered across Sarah's face, casting shadows that deepened the lines etched by years Henry hadn't seen. She stood in the center of the Hamptons' mansion's grand living room, her thin coat still dusted with snow, the old envelope clutched in her hands like a weapon. Henry remained by the door, the whiskey glass forgotten on the side table, its ice melting into a puddle that mirrored the chaos pooling in his chest. The air between them crackled with 40 years of silence, broken only by the snap of the logs in the hearth and the faint hum of the wind outside. Sarah's words, Jacob, your grandson, hung heavy, a truth he couldn't grasp, a name that felt foreign yet pierced him like a shard of glass. He straightened, forcing his voice to steady, the old instincts of control kicking in. What do you mean you're running out of time? He asked, his tone sharp, clipped, the way he'd spoken to boardroom adversaries for decades. But Sarah wasn't a rival to be dismissed. She stepped forward, her boots leaving damp trails on the polished floor, and stopped just close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her hazel eyes, Eleanor's eyes, hardened by a life he'd abandoned. Without a word, she thrust the envelope at him, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from something deeper. Henry took it, the paper brittle under his touch, and pulled out a single sheet, a medical report, stark and clinical. The words blurred at first, but then they sharpened. Congestive heart failure. Prognosis, 3 to 6 months. His breath, caught, a rare falter in the man who'd faced down market crashes without blinking. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and saw no tears, only a quiet fury that pinned him where he stood. I'm dying, Dad, she said, her voice low but steady, each syllable a hammer strike. And you've got a grandson out there who doesn't even know your name. So I'm asking you, do you dare meet him? Or are you going to run again like you did with us? The question hit harder than any accusation. Henry's hand tightened around the paper, crumpling its edge, his mind racing to catch up. A grandson. Jacob. The room seemed to shrink, the opulence of the chandelier and the velvet drapes fading into a suffocating blur. He'd left Eleanor and Sarah behind 40 years ago, trading family dinners for late-night deals, convincing himself that success was a fair exchange for their absence. Now standing before him was the cost, a daughter he barely knew, a death sentence in her hands, and a boy he'd never imagined. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He snapped, the words escaping before he could temper them, his voice rising, with a mix of anger and disbelief. It was the wrong thing to say. He knew it the moment her eyes narrowed, the firelight glinting off them like steel. Sarah stepped closer, her small frame suddenly towering in its resolve. She reached out, not with force but with purpose, and pressed her hand against his chest, pushing him back until he hit the wall. The impact was light, but it stunned him, the cold plaster against his spine a jolt to his senses. Because you were never there to ask, she said, her voice cutting through him, sharp and unyielding. You left Mom and me for your empire. You didn't call, didn't write, didn't care. And now you think you can just step in when it's convenient? Her hand dropped, but her words held him there, pinned as surely as if she'd driven nails through his suit. Henry's jaw clenched, his pride warring with the guilt that clawed at his gut. He wanted to argue, to defend the choices he'd made. Eleanor had wanted a simpler life. He'd wanted more, and the rift had grown too wide to bridge. But the excuse felt hollow now, a flimsy shield against the truth in Sarah's eyes. He'd run, yes, but not from them. From himself. From the fear that he couldn't be enough without the power he'd chased. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice quieter, fraying at the edges. I didn't know about any of this. Sarah's lips twisted, a bitter half-smile. You didn't want to know. You abandoned us for money, Dad. And now you're going to abandon Jacob too? The name again, Jacob. It landed like a stone, sinking into the silence that followed. Henry's mind flashed to the photograph in the drawer, to Sarah's tiny hand in his, and he wondered what Jacob looked like, whether he had Eleanor's eyes or his own stubborn jaw. The thought twisted something deep inside him, a pang he couldn't name. He opened his mouth to respond, but his phone buzzed again, insistent, pulling him back to the world he'd built. He glanced at it, Claire, warning him the article was, Live, the stock already dipping. The press would feast on this. Henry Caldwell, the man who traded his family for a fortune. He could hear the headlines now, feel the weight of the board's scrutiny. But Sarah didn't move, didn't soften. She stood there, a mother fighting for her son, a daughter demanding answers, and for the first time in years, Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. His empire, his honor, his carefully constructed life. It all seemed fragile against the reality of her words. He looked down at the crumpled report in his hand, then back at her, and the question slipped out, raw and unguarded. What do you want from me, Sarah? She didn't hesitate. I want you to be a father. For once. Not a checkbook, not a name on a building. A father. Jacob deserves that. And I don't have time to wait. The fire snapped behind her, a log collapsing into ash, and Henry felt the heat on his face, the weight of her challenge pressing down. He'd spent a lifetime running from this moment, from the vulnerability of family, from the man he might have been. Now, with Sarah's life ticking away and a grandson he didn't, no waiting somewhere in the cold, he had no more room to run. The wall at his back was solid, but inside, something was breaking. Something he'd buried long ago, stirring to life in the glow of that Christmas fire. The air in Henry Caldwell's study carried the faint scent of aged oak and leather-bound books, a sanctuary of order within the sprawling Hamptons mansion. A single brass lamp cast a golden glow over the room, illuminating shelves lined with financial journals and a desk that had witnessed decades of calculated triumphs. Henry stood by the safe embedded in the wall, its steel door creaking as he opened it, revealing a small stack of keepsakes he'd buried long ago. Among them was the photograph, him, Eleanor, and Sarah, frozen in a moment of sunlight and smiles. He set it on the desk, its edges worn from years of hidden glances, and turned to Sarah, who sat in the armchair across from him. Her coat was draped over the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the medical report still crumpled on the floor where he'd dropped it. The fire from the living room couldn't reach here, but the chill between them was its own kind of flame. Sarah's voice broke the silence, steady but threaded with exhaustion. Jacob asks about you every day, she said, her gaze fixed on the photo. I tell him you're busy saving the world. It's easier than the truth. She paused, her fingers tightening. He's 12 now. Loves fixing things. Bikes, radios, anything he can get his hands on. Every night I'd make pancakes in our little kitchen, and he'd sit there tinkering, asking why his grandpa never visits. Henry's chest tightened, a dull ache spreading as he pictured it. A boy he didn't know, a kitchen he'd never seen, a life he'd let slip away. He turned away, pretending to adjust the lamp, but his hand lingered on the switch, unsteady. I didn't know, he said, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the wind outside. It was a weak defense, and he knew it. But the words slipped out anyway, a reflex from a man who'd spent a lifetime justifying his choices. Sarah stood, crossing the room with a quiet resolve that made the space feel smaller. She reached into her bag and pulled out a bundle of letters, their envelopes yellowed and creased, tied with a faded ribbon. She placed them on the desk beside the photo, her fingers brushing the paper as if it held a piece of her soul. "You wrote these," she said, her tone flat but piercing. "Mom kept them after you left. I found them when she died." Henry stared at the letters, his breath catching. He recognized his own handwriting, sharp, precise, the script of a younger man who'd once believed in promises. He untied the ribbon, his hands trembling as he opened the first one. "Sarah, my little star," it began. "I'll be home soon, I promise. Work's just busy right now, but I'll bring you that doll you wanted. Love, Dad." The words blurred, ink smudged by time, and he remembered those nights. Holed up in a Manhattan hotel, whiskey in one hand, pen in the other, writing letters he'd never send. He'd torn most of them up, ashamed of the man who couldn't keep his word. But these, Eleanor had saved these. "I didn't know she kept them," he murmured, his voice cracking. He looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes, and saw something shift, anger giving way to a raw, unguarded pain. "She waited for you. Until the end," Sarah said, her words a quiet blade. "She'd sit by the window every night hoping you'd walk through the door. She never stopped believing you'd come back." The room spun, the weight of her words pressing down like a physical force. Henry sank into the chair behind the desk, the letters spilling across the surface. He saw it now. Eleanor in their old Brooklyn apartment, her auburn hair catching the lamplight, her voice soft as she begged him to stay. He'd walked out anyway, chasing a dream of power, telling himself it was for them, that the money would make it right. But it hadn't. Eleanor had died alone, and Sarah had grown up without him, raising a son in a world he'd never bothered to enter. "Why didn't you reach out?" he asked, his voice hoarse, the question aimed as much at himself as at her. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, and she leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Because you made it clear we weren't enough," she said, each word deliberate, cutting. "You chose your skyscrapers over us. I worked double shifts as a nurse to keep a roof over Jacob's head, taught him how to flip pancakes when the power got cut off. I didn't want your pity, or your money. I wanted a father." Her words landed like blows, stripping away the armor he'd worn for decades. He thought of the penthouse in Manhattan, the late-night signing deals, the empty victories that had filled his life. He'd told himself he was building something lasting, something honorable, but now, with Sarah's life slipping away and a grandson he'd never met waiting in the shadows, it felt like ash. The photograph stared up at him, a relic of a man he barely recognized, and he wondered how he'd let it all slip so far. "I didn't know how to come back," he admitted, the confession spilling out, raw and unpolished. "I thought you were better off without me." Sarah's eyes softened just for a moment before the steel returned. "Jacob deserves better than that," she said, "and so did I." She straightened, stepping back, her voice firm. "You've got a chance now, Dad. Don't waste it." The size lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the room, and Henry sat there, the letters spread before him like a map of his failures. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the storm was louder. A reckoning he couldn't escape, a past he could no longer bury. The wind howled outside the Hamptons' mansion, a relentless wail that battered the windows and sent snow swirling across the lawn. Inside, the study felt like a tomb. Silent, heavy with the weight of Sarah's words and the letters strewn across Henry Caldwell's desk. The photograph of him, Eleanor, and a young Sarah sat among them, a fragile relic of a life he'd abandoned. Henry stood by the window, his breath fogging the glass, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. Sarah's voice still echoed in his ears. "You've got a chance now, Dad. Don't waste it." And it gnawed at him, a challenge he couldn't dismiss. He'd spent 40 years building walls of wealth and power, but tonight, those walls were crumbling. and he didn't know how to stop the fall. He turned from the desk, his gaze drifting to the window, and froze. Beyond the frosted pane, a small figure stood in the snow. A boy, no more than 12, hunched against the cold beside an old, rusted sedan parked in the driveway. His coat was too thin, his dark hair tousled by the wind, and in his hands, he clutched a makeshift model of a bicycle, its wires glinting faintly under the porch light. Henry's heart stuttered, a jolt of recognition he couldn't place. Jacob, his grandson. The boy Sarah had raised alone, the boy he'd never known existed, until an hour ago. Sarah's voice cut through the silence behind him. "He's been waiting out there," she said, her tone softer now, but still edged with steel. "Didn't want to come in until I told him it was okay. He's stubborn, like you." She stepped closer, her boots scuffing the hardwood, and Henry turned to face her, the letters still burning in his mind. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" he asked, his voice rough, the question a plea as much as an accusation. But before she could answer, she reached into her bag again, pulling out a single sheet of paper, a deed, its ink faded but legible. She held it out, her eyes locking with his, and the truth hit him like a wave. "You bought our house," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "5 years ago, when the bank was about to take it. I thought it was some anonymous donor, some charity case. But it was you, wasn't it? You paid for it through one of your damn trusts and never said a word." Henry's throat closed, the deed slipping from his fingers to the floor. He remembered that day, sitting in his Manhattan office, signing off on a discreet transfer, telling himself it was enough, that it absolved him. He'd tracked Sarah down through private investigators, learned she was struggling, and acted without facing her. It was a coward's move, a check written in place of courage, and now, with her standing before him, it felt like nothing at all. "You think money fixes everything, don't you?" Sarah said, her voice rising, sharp enough to cut through the haze of his guilt. "You thought you could buy us off and stay clean? I didn't need your charity, Dad. I needed you." The words stung, each one a lash against the pride he'd worn like armor. He opened his mouth to argue, to explain, but the sound of the front door creaking open stopped him cold. Footsteps, small, hesitant, echoed through the hall, and then Jacob appeared in the doorway, snow clinging to his sneakers, his model, bike still in hand. He was small for his age, wiry, with dark eyes that darted between Sarah and Henry, unsure but curious. His coat hung loose, patched at the elbows, and his cheeks were red from the cold. Sarah knelt beside him, brushing snow from his hair. "It's okay, Jake," she said, her voice softening into something tender. "This is your grandpa." Jacob looked up at Henry, his head tilting slightly, and then he spoke, his voice quiet, but clear. "Are you the guy in the picture Mommy keeps? The one she said was too busy to visit?" The question was a knife, simple and unadorned, slicing through Henry's defenses. He saw it then, the photo Sarah must have kept, the same one on his desk, a snapshot of a family he'd walked away from. He took a step forward, then stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. I was, he said, the words catching in his throat. "But I'm here now." Jacob frowned, studying him, then held up the model bike. "I made this," he said, a hint of pride breaking through his shyness. "Mom says I'm good at fixing stuff, like you were." Henry's knees buckled, and before he knew it, he was kneeling, eye level with the boy. He reached out, hesitant, and took the model, its wires cold against his fingers. "You're better than I ever was," he said, his voice breaking. And then, without thinking, he pulled Jacob into his arms, the boy's small frame stiffening at first, then relaxing against him. Snow melted onto Henry's suit, soaking through, but he didn't care. He held on, tears burning his eyes, the first he'd shed in decades. Sarah watched, her expression unreadable, but her hands trembled as she clasped them together. "He's all I've got left," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm not letting him grow up like I did, wondering why you weren't there." Henry looked up at her over Jacob's shoulder, the weight of her words sinking in. The deed on the floor, the letters on the desk, the boy in his arms. They were pieces of a life he'd tried to erase, a debt he could no longer ignore. He'd thought money could mend what he'd broken, but now, with Jacob's heartbeat against his chest and Sarah's life slipping away, he saw the truth. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. "I'm not running anymore," he said, his voice raw, a vow to them both. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing the world in white. But inside, something shifted. A crack in the ice, a chance to begin again. The dining room of Henry Caldwell's Hamptons mansion gleamed with understated opulence. A long mahogany table stretched beneath a chandelier that dripped crystal like frozen tears, casting prisms of light across the walls. The fire from the living room sent a faint warmth through the open doorway, but it couldn't touch the tension that hung over the room like a storm cloud. Henry sat at the head of the table, his suit jacket unbuttoned for the first time that night, his silver hair catching the glow. Across from him, Sarah settled into a chair, her coat folded neatly beside her, while Jacob perched on the edge of his seat, his model bicycle resting on the table like a talisman. The meal before them was simple: bread and a pot of vegetable soup Sarah had brought, its steam curling upward, filling the air with a scent that tugged at Henry's memory. It smelled like Eleanor's kitchen, like home, a lifetime ago. For a moment, no one spoke. The clink of Jacob's spoon against the bowl was the only sound, his small hands moving with a hunger that made Henry's stomach twist. He watched the boy eat, tearing bread into chunks and dipping them into the broth. His dark eyes focused on the task as if it were a rare treat. Sarah sipped her soup slowly, her gaze flickering between her son and the man she'd called father, her silence a wall Henry didn't know how to breach. He'd held Jacob in his arms an hour ago, felt the boy's heartbeat against his own, and promised not to run. But now, with the weight of that vow pressing down, he felt adrift, a stranger at his own table. "I can help," he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet, firm but unsteady at the edges. "With money. For you. For Jacob. Whatever. You need school, a better place to live. I can make it right." Sarah's spoon paused midair, her eyes narrowing as she set it down with a deliberate clink. "We don't need your charity, Dad," she said, her tone cold, sharp enough to slice through the room's fragile peace. "I didn't bring Jacob here for a handout. I've kept us going without you for 12 years. Double shifts, late nights, every dime I had. We're not your pity project." The words stung, a rebuke that echoed the deed she'd thrown at him earlier, the house he'd bought in secret thinking it was enough. Henry's hand tightened around his own spoon, the metal cool against his palm, and he leaned forward, his voice rising. "I'm not offering pity," he snapped, the old fire of a boardroom titan flaring up. "I'm offering a chance to fix this, to help you, damn it. Why won't you let me?" Sarah's chair scraped back as she stood, her small frame taut with fury. "Fix this?" she shot back, her voice trembling but fierce. "You think money fixes a mother who died waiting for you? A daughter who grew up wondering why she wasn't enough? You can't buy back those years, Dad. You can't buy Jacob a grandfather who shows up when it's convenient." Her words hit like a hammer, each one cracking the facade Henry had clung to for decades. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound reverberating off the walls, the chandelier trembling above. "I'm trying, Sarah," he shouted, his control slipping, raw desperation bleeding through. "I know I failed you. I failed your mother. But I'm here now. Let me do something." Jacob flinched, his spoon clattering to the table, his wide eyes darting between them. Sarah's face softened for a split second, and she reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Jake," she murmured, her voice steadying for him. But when she turned back to Henry, the steel returned. "You don't get it," she said, quieter now but no less cutting. "I didn't need your money then, and I don't need it now. I needed you." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling like dust. Henry sank back in his chair, his hand falling. To his lap, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Jacob, the boy's small frame hunched over the bowl, and saw a hunger that went beyond food, a hunger for something he'd never given Sarah. His mind flashed to Eleanor, her gentle hands kneading dough in their old kitchen, her voice calling him to dinner. He'd walked away from that, from her, from them, and now the cost sat across from him, eating soup he hadn't earned the right to share. His phone buzzed on the table, a harsh intrusion that shattered the moment. He glanced at it. Claire again. Articles live. Stocks down 5%. Board's calling an emergency meeting tomorrow. The words blurred, the weight of his empire pressing in, a reminder of the life he'd chosen over this one. He could hear the headlines now, Caldwell's family secret sink shares, and feel the board's cold judgment. But for the first time it didn't matter, not as much as the boy tearing bread, the daughter staring him down. Sarah sat back down, her hands folding in her lap, her voice low but firm. You want to help, Dad? Then be here, not with your wallet, with you. Jacob deserves a grandfather who stays. Henry looked at her, then at Jacob, who'd resumed eating, his small fingers clutching the spoon like a lifeline. The chandelier's light glinted off the table, a stark contrast to the simplicity of the meal, and Henry felt the dissonance of his life laid bare, wealth he'd amassed, a family he'd lost. He'd offered money because it was all he knew, all he'd trusted to solve problems. But Sarah was right. It couldn't buy back the past, couldn't fill the empty chair by the fire. I don't know how, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, a confession that stripped him bare. But I'll try. Sarah's eyes held his searching, and for a moment, the storm between them stilled. Outside, the wind battered the windows, but inside, the soup steamed on, a fragile thread tying them together, one Henry wasn't sure he could hold. The garage of Henry Caldwell's, Hampton's mansion, smelled of oil and rust, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the rooms beyond. A single fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the concrete floor where Henry knelt beside Jacob, the boy's small hands guiding a wrench around the rusted chain of an old bicycle. Snow tapped against the window, a soft counterpoint to the clink of metal, and for a fleeting moment Henry felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Jacob's dark hair fell into his eyes as he worked, his tongue poking out in concentration, and Henry couldn't help but smile. You're good at this, he said, his voice rough but warm, the first unguarded words he'd spoken all night. Jacob grinned, a shy flash of teeth, and handed him the wrench. Mom says I get it from you. The words hung there, simple and heavy, a thread tying Henry to a past he'd tried to forget. He took the wrench, his fingers brushing Jacob's, and felt the weight of that legacy, a skill he'd once loved, abandoned for boardrooms and balance sheets. The bike was Sarah's, he realized, its faded red paint chipped from years of use, a relic of the little girl he'd left behind. He tightened a bolt, the motion steadying him, and for a moment, the garage was a refuge, a place where he could be more than the man who'd failed. But the moment shattered with a crash from the house. Henry's head snapped up, the wrench slipping from his hand as Jacob's eyes widened. Mom, the boy whispered, scrambling to his feet. Henry followed, his heart pounding, and they burst through the side door into the living room. Sarah lay crumpled by the hearth, her body slumped against the rug, one hand clutching her chest. The fire roared behind her, its light painting her face in a sickly glow, and a broken mug lay in pieces beside her, coffee pooling dark against the cream wool. Sarah! Henry's voice broke as he dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her eyes fluttering, and Jacob's cry cut through the haze. Mom, wake up! Henry grabbed his phone, fumbling with the screen, and barked into it. 911, now! Hampton's, Caldwell Estate. Heart attack. Hurry. He tossed it aside, his hands shaking as he pressed them to her shoulders, her skin clammy beneath his palms. Hold on, Sarah, he pleaded, his voice raw. I'm not losing you. Not again. Jacob knelt beside him, tears streaking his face, and thrust a small wooden box into Henry's hands. She told me to give you this if something happened, he sobbed, his voice breaking. Henry stared at it, the carved lid worn smooth, and flipped it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a journal, its pages yellowed, Eleanor's handwriting spilling across them in tight, careful loops. He flipped to the last entry, dated a week before her death. "Henry, you're a good man beneath it all. I never blamed you, I just wanted you home. If you ever read this, know I forgave you. Give Sarah and our grandson the love I couldn't anymore." The words hit him like a tidal wave, crashing through the walls he'd built around his heart. Eleanor had forgiven him years ago, silently, while he'd drowned in guilt and whiskey. Sarah had known, had carried this secret to shield him from his own shame. And now she lay here slipping away. He clutched the journal, his vision blurring with tears, and looked at her, her chest rising faintly. "You knew," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You both did." Sarah's eyes flickered open, pain clouding them, and she gripped his hand, her fingers weak but fierce. "Don't let Jacob grow up like me," she rasped, each word a struggle. "No father. Promise me." "I promise," Henry choked out, his voice a roar against the storm inside him. "I swear, Sarah, I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." He held her hand tighter, his other arm pulling Jacob close, the boy's sobs muffled against his chest. The fire snapped behind them, a log collapsing into ash, and Henry felt the weight of his failures bearing down. The years he'd run, the love he'd buried, the family he'd let slip through his fingers. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, but time stretched thin, each second a knife's edge. Henry's mind raced. Eleanor's forgiveness, Sarah's sacrifice, Jacob's trust, all colliding in this moment, demanding he be more than the man he'd been. He'd spent a lifetime controlling empires, bending markets to his will, but here on his knees by the hearth, he was powerless. All he could do was hold on, to Sarah's fading grip, to Jacob's trembling frame, to the vow he'd just made. "You're enough," he said, his voice breaking as he looked at Sarah, then Jacob. "You always were. I was the one who wasn't." Sarah's lips curved, a ghost of a smile, and her eyes fluttered shut again, her hand slackening in his. Jacob buried his face deeper, his small body shaking, and Henry held them both, the journal pressed against his chest like a lifeline. The paramedics burst through the door, their boots pounding the marble, voices sharp with urgency. Henry didn't move, didn't let go, even as they swarmed around Sarah, their hands pulling her from him. He stayed there, kneeling, Jacob in his arms, the fire's heat searing his back. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. "Give them the love I couldn't." And he knew this was his breaking point, the moment he'd either rise or fall forever. He'd run from love once, but not again. Not now. The hospital room was a sterile cocoon of white walls, white sheets, white lights that buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow over Sarah's still form. Henry Caldwell sat beside her bed, his suit rumpled, the sleeves stained with oil from the garage and damp from melted snow. His hands rested on his knees, clenched into fists to stop their trembling, the wooden box with Eleanor's journal tucked against his side like a shield. Across the room, Jacob curled up in a vinyl chair, his small body swallowed by his patched coat, his model bicycle clutched in his lap as he slept. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence, a fragile rhythm that tethered Sarah to life, and Henry watched it, each spike a prayer he didn't know how to voice. The paramedics had arrived in a blur of red lights and shouted commands, pulling Sarah from his arms and rushing her through the snow to this place. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, had emerged an hour ago, her words clipped but hopeful. "She's stable for now. We've got her on medication, but she'll need surgery soon. It's a miracle she held on this long." Henry had nodded, numb, his mind still trapped in the living room, replaying Sarah's collapse, her rasped plea. "Don't let Jacob grow up like me," and the weight of Eleanor's forgiveness in that journal. He'd promised her, promised them both, and now, sitting here, he felt the full force of what that meant. He reached for Sarah's hand, her fingers cool and limp beneath his, and traced the lines of her palm. Lines he hadn't known, hadn't cared to learn until now. "I've been a fool," he whispered, his voice rough, barely audible over the hum of machines. All those years, I thought I was building something, honor, legacy. But it was nothing without you, without her. He glanced at the journal, Eleanor's words burning in his memory. Give them the love I couldn't. And felt a tear slip down his cheek, hot against his skin. He didn't wipe it away. For once, he let it fall. The door creaked open, and a nurse stepped in, her clipboard rustling. Mr. Caldwell, your assistant's on the line. Says it's urgent, something about a board meeting. Henry's jaw tightened, the outside world clawing its way back in. He waved her off without looking up. Tell her I'm not available, he said, his tone flat, final. The nurse hesitated, then nodded and slipped out, leaving him with the beep of the monitor and the weight of his choice. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with missed calls. Claire, the board, investors, all buzzing with panic over the article, the stock drop, the empire teetering on the edge. Tomorrow was the emergency meeting, a transatlantic flight to London he'd scheduled months ago, a deal that could secure his legacy for another decade. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over Claire's number, and then shut it off, the light fading to black. He set it on the table next to Jacob's bike and turned back to Sarah. For the first time in 40 years, he chose them over it, over the power, the money, the honor he'd chased at their expense. I'm staying, he said, louder now, a vow to the room, to her. No more running. He squeezed her hand, willing her to hear him, to feel the truth in it. Jacob stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and Henry reached out, brushing the boy's hair back. You okay, kid? He asked, his voice softening. Jacob nodded, rubbing his eyes, then looked at Sarah, his small face crumpling. Is Mom gonna be okay? He whispered, his voice trembling. Henry pulled him close, lifting him onto his lap despite the awkwardness of the chair, and held him tight. She's a fighter, he said, his tone steady despite the ache in his chest. Like you. We're not giving up on her. The boy nestled against him, his breath warm against Henry's neck, and for a moment, they sat there, two souls clinging to hope in a sea of white. Henry's mind drifted to Eleanor's kitchen, to the nights he'd stayed late at the office, to the life he'd traded for a penthouse view. The smell of antiseptic stung his nose, a far cry from the bread and soup they'd shared hours ago, but it grounded him, a reminder of where he was now, where he needed to be. He reached for the phone again, this time dialing his lawyer. It's Henry, he said when the man picked up, his voice low but firm. Draft a new will. Half my estate goes to Sarah and Jacob, effective immediately, and find the best heart surgeon in the country. I don't care what it costs. He hung up without waiting for a reply, his decision made, a weight lifting even as another settled in its place. Sarah's eyes flickered open, faint but alive, and she turned her head, meeting his gaze. Dad, she rasped, her voice a thread. Henry leaned forward, his hand tightening around hers. I'm here, he said, his voice breaking. I'll take care of you both. I swear it, even if I don't deserve it. A ghost of a smile touched her lips and she whispered, You're here now. That's enough. Her eyes closed again, but her grip lingered, weak but real, and Henry felt something shift. A peace he hadn't known he could find, Jacob's weight against him, Sarah's hand in his, the journal at his side. They were his anchor, his redemption. The hospital lights buzzed on, cold and unyielding, but to Henry, they were a beacon, guiding him back to the man he should have been. He'd lost so much, but not this, not them, not yet. Spring sunlight streamed through the wide windows of Henry Caldwell's Hamptons mansion, bathing the living room in a golden warmth that softened the edges of its grandeur. The fire in the hearth burned low, a gentle crackle rather than the roaring blaze of that Christmas Eve 4 months ago. The air smelled of fresh grass and possibility, carried in on a breeze that rustled the curtains. Henry sat on the floor, beside the coffee table, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, a toolbox open at his side. Jacob sprawled across from him, his dark hair tousled, a screwdriver in one hand and a half-assembled bicycle wheel in the other. Sarah rested on the couch nearby, a blanket draped over her legs, her face still pale but alive with a quiet strength. The surgery, funded by Henry's insistence and the best cardiologist money could hire, had given her back the months she'd thought lost. And now, in this room, they were rebuilding more than just a bike. "Pass me the wrench, Grandpa," Jacob said, his voice bright, a grin tugging at his lips as he wrestled with a stubborn bolt. Henry handed it over, his hand steady now, no longer trembling with the weight of regret. "You're getting good at this," he said, a warmth in his tone that felt new, earned. Jacob laughed, a sound that filled the space like music, and Henry caught Sarah's eye, seeing the flicker of a smile she tried to hide. It was a small moment, ordinary and perfect, the kind he'd missed for 40 years. Outside, the lawn stretched green and endless, and earlier that morning, Henry had taken Jacob there, teaching him to ride the bike they'd fixed together. Boy had wobbled at first, his knees scraping the gravel, but Henry had run alongside, steadying the handlebars, cheering as Jacob found his balance. When he fell, Henry was there to pick him up, brushing dirt from his coat, laughing with him in a way he'd never done with Sarah. Now, back inside, the memory lingered, a balm to the wounds of the past. Sarah shifted, pulling the blanket tighter, and nodded at the wall above the hearth. "You hung them up," she said, her voice soft but clear. Henry followed her gaze to two framed pictures side by side, the old photograph of him, Eleanor, and Sarah, its faded colors glowing in the light, and a new drawing by Jacob, crayon lines depicting the three of them around the fire. Stick figures, with wide smiles. "Seemed right," Henry replied, his throat tightening. They belonged together. He'd made other changes too, ones that went beyond this room. The article that had threatened his empire had been retracted, not by force, but by truth. He'd called a press conference from the hospital, his voice steady as he admitted his failures. "I left my family for success, and it was the worst deal I ever made. I'm here to fix it." The board had grumbled, the stock had dipped, but it rebounded when the public saw a man owning his mistakes. Half his estate was now in a trust for Sarah and Jacob, a promise kept, and he'd stepped back from the day-to-day grind, leaving Claire to handle the firm. For the first time, he wasn't running Caldwell Investments, he was running toward something else. Sarah watched him, her eyes searching, and then she spoke, her words deliberate. "You didn't have to do all this, Dad. The money, the surgery. I didn't expect it." Henry set down the wrench, meeting her gaze. "I know," he said, his voice low but firm. "But I had to. Not because it fixes everything, it doesn't. I can't bring your mom back, can't give you those years, but I can be here now. That's what honor is, Sarah. Not the money, not the name. It's this." He gestured to the room, to Jacob, to her, his hand shaking slightly with the weight of it. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, and wiped it away quickly. "You're here now," she said, echoing her words from the hospital. But this time they carried a different weight. Acceptance, not just hope. Jacob looked up, oblivious to the depth of the moment, and grinned. "Grandpa's pretty cool," he said, tightening the bolt with a flourish. "He's better at fixing stuff than Mom said." Sarah laughed, a sound Henry hadn't heard since she was a child, and it broke something open inside him, a joy he'd forgotten he could feel. "He's learning," she said, her eyes twinkling, and Henry chuckled, the sound rusty but real. The day stretched on, simple and full. Jacob racing around the lawn again, Sarah joining them with a cup of tea, Henry pushing her to rest but grinning when she refused. Later, they sat by the hearth, the fire low but steady, and Henry pulled Jacob onto his lap, the boy's head resting against his chest. Sarah sat beside them, her hand brushing Jacob's hair, and for the first time, the chair by the fire wasn't empty. It held them all, in the space between words, in the quiet of a family pieced back together. "You know," Henry said, his voice soft, reflective, "I spent my life chasing something I thought was honor, power, Success. But it was nothing. Compared to this, he looked at Sarah, then Jacob, and felt the truth settle deep. "You're the ones who taught me that." Jacob yawned, nestling closer. "You're pretty good at being a grandpa," he mumbled, his eyes drifting shut. Henry smiled, a tear slipping free, and Sarah reached over, squeezing his hand. "You're getting there," she said, her voice warm, forgiving. The fire crackled on, its light dancing across the room, and outside, the spring breeze carried the promise of new beginnings. Henry held them close, the weight of his past still there, but lighter now, softened by the love he'd finally let in. The chair was filled, and with it a piece of his heart he'd thought lost forever. The fire dwindled to embers, its soft glow fading into the night, but the warmth lingered in the room, a warmth born not of flames, but of the hands clasped. Together, the laughter shared, the silences healed. He looked at them, the family he'd almost lost, and knew this was the legacy that mattered. Not the wealth he'd amassed, but the love he'd finally claimed. Outside, the world turned on. Indifferent, but here in this quiet corner they'd found something timeless. A second chance, a home rebuilt from ashes. And as the last ember flickered out, he smiled, certain at last that he'd never let it go again. If this journey moved you, hit that like button. It means the world to me. And if you want more stories that tug at your heart and lift your spirit, subscribe now. Let's keep the fire burning together.